Hello, and today we're going to be looking at the transatlantic slave trade as part of this developing global trade network between 1450 and 1750. So, before we begin, we want to bring in three basic terms that we just want to be aware of when we talk about the system of trade that develops during this time. The first thing is this concept of the transatlantic trade network. So, throughout this course, we've talked about this idea of the Indian Ocean trade network, the Silk Road, the Mediterranean trade network, the Trans Saharan trade network. And now, what we're going to do is add in a new trade network called the transatlantic trade. And then you can add in one more called the Manila Galleon. And you can add in either another one, the sub or the Southern African route. So what we're doing is we're creating new trade routes during this time, and we want to know them by name. In this case, the transatlantic trade is going to connect Europe to the Americas and to Africa. So now we're going to connect these three continents together in a trade network and seeing a variety of people and goods exchanging over that trade network. So we can also call this trade network the triangular trade because of the shape of the trade. From Europe to Africa, we see manufactured goods such as textiles, rum, and also we can put in firearms that are coming from Western Europe to Africa. So European technology and European goods are coming into the African systems. From Africa to the Americas, we have the transport of enslaved Africans. And this is the defining feature of the transatlantic trade network. So the transportation of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Now, us being inhabitants of the United States, we tend to associate this with the United States. But you have to recognize that it's more than just the United States. It's also the West Indies, it's Central America, and it's South America as well. So when I say the Americas, I'm talking about the whole region. And then from the Americas back to Europe, you have cash crops being transported, such as cotton, such as tobacco, and especially sugar. And sugar is going to be the key character of this story. And you can also throw in silver. So you have these raw materials going from the Americas over to Europe. Europe is refining and using those raw materials and putting them into the market. And then manufactured goods are coming into Africa. And then enslaved Africans are going to the Americas. So we create this triangular trade. And that's what we mean by triangular trade. And the last thing is the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is a reference to the segment of the triangular trade that connects Africa to the Americas. And along this segment travels the enslaved Africans who have been um, transported to the Americas to be bought and sold into the system of slavery in the Americas. So those three terms are basic terms that you want to just understand as we talk about this trade system. The second thing we want to talk about is the uniqueness of slavery in the Americas. And again, I want you to think bigger than just the United States. This is something that impacts the whole region, not just the United States. So slavery has been part of world history since civilization was born. We're not so sure if hunters and gatherers engaged in slavery, but we definitely know that when civilization started to pop up and engage in agriculture, slavery as a system started to grow. So slavery is not a new invention in the 1600s. But what slavery is doing is increasing in its magnitude. So the system of slavery is growing much larger than anything we had seen before. And a new form of slavery is going to take place, which we call chattel slavery. And chattel slavery represents the slavery of the Americas, where enslaved Africans are being bought and sold on the open market as we would buy and sell oil, silver, gold, any of the commodities. In other words, in chattel slavery, the enslaved African is no longer a human, but rather a piece of property that can be bought and sold under contractual laws. And what chattel slavery does is it dehumanizes the enslaved Africans in a way that we haven't seen before. They're just seen as part of the system. Second thing we want to talk about is the idea that this form of slavery in the Americas becomes strongly associated with the concept of race. And the idea that somebody who is of African descent would be associated with the enslaved class of the Americas becomes a strong connection. And it's going to deal with the types of rights that these individuals will have even when they're not in a state of slavery. So you have this idea that ethnicity and race gets tied in strongly to slavery. And that's not something we've really seen throughout world history. We have seen um, people who have been enslaved before, but oftentimes, for example, in European history, oftentimes those enslaved individuals are coming from the same ethnicity as the enslavers. But in this case, we have this strong connection between being African and being enslaved within the Americas. And in fact, unlike other institutions of slavery throughout world history, if somebody is born to an enslaved African, they are by birth enslaved. So this idea that being enslaved is a hereditary trait or a hereditary condition, I should say, is something unique that we haven't really seen before in history. And then the last thing we want to note is that the role that plantation agriculture plays in this development of the slavery system in the Americas. So we'll talk more about this in a second. But the idea is that as the Portuguese and the Spanish come over to the Americas, they begin to cultivate crops, sugar being amongst the highest of them. But also, they cultivate cotton and tobacco, and they also mine silver. So, this plantation agriculture, and we can throw in the mining operations, but the plantation agriculture is what drives the need to import enslaved Africans. This is the reason why there is a slavery system in the Americas. Usually, of the past, slavery was more domestic based. In other words, you had a king, or you had nobility, or you had a wealthy family who would have one or two enslaved individuals who tended to the house, cooked, cleaned, took care of children. This is what we would refer to more as domestic labor. So when we look at earlier forms of of slavery systems, what we see is domestic forms of slavery. And those domestic forms of slavery are going to be largely women as opposed to men. With the development of the plantation agriculture and the demand for more of an enslaved labor force, you get a shift. And the shift is now going to be to manual workers who are working in the fields. And therefore, they're going to focus more on men than women because of the nature of the work. So that's why slavery in the Americas is a unique version of slavery throughout history. So let's talk now about why there's a growth in enslaved Africans in the Americas in the 1700s. So the first thing is that there's a decline of the indigenous population. When the Europeans initially come over, the first group that's enslaved are the Native Americans. And Native Americans are sent to seek out gold and silver and bring it back to the European colonial governors or the colonial bosses, whatever you want to refer to them as. Um, they are working in the mines. They do work on plantations. But as you may recall, one of the consequences of the Columbian Exchange is the spread of disease. And the disease decimates the population. So as the disease decimates the population, the Native Americans are becoming less of a reliable source of enslaved labor. The second thing is that throughout the Afro-Eurasian trade network, even before this discovery of the New World and this global interconnection, Africans were already being enslaved. there was already an active trade network for enslaved Africans. The trans-Saharan trade saw the transport of enslaved Africans across the Sahara Desert into the Middle East, throughout the Indian Ocean, and it did connect, though much more minimally, to Western Europe. So there was already a practice of the buying and selling of enslaved Africans. The scale of it was much smaller than what we're going to see develop, but that practice was already there. And so what happens is that as the Europeans and the Americas demand enslaved labor, the existing practice is tapped into and is reoriented away from the Indian Ocean and from the Middle East and towards the Americas. And then the numbers begin to grow. And why do the numbers grow? So as you look at the chart on your right, you see that right around 16 to 1700, there's a substantial increase. But then from 1700 to 1800, there is a huge boom of enslaved Africans who are being transported across that middle passage. So you can see the numbers grow significantly throughout the 1700s. And the reason why is because of cash crops in the Americas. And the idea is that as cash crops grow and as cash crops expand, as the plantation economy expands in the Americas, the demand for enslaved Africans grows as well, which is going to lead to an increasing business of slavery and this transatlantic slave trade. And the biggest culprit is sugar. So sugar in the 18th century is becoming highly demanded in Europe. People are consuming sugar at much higher levels. So sugar demand is going to drive the demand for enslaved Africans. So as the sugar plantations grow in the 17th, 18th century, which is your 1700s, as that grows, more enslaved Africans are going to be brought over to the Americas and to work on those plantations, the sugar plantations. And frankly, sugar plantations were some of the most dangerous and hazardous work that was out there, to the point that your average lifespan of an enslaved African on a plantation was probably into their late 20s, early 30s. The work was that arduous. And so as enslaved Africans die from the labor, the Europeans say we need to replenish, and that drives the trade network even more. It drives those numbers even more. So when we talk about the destination of enslaved Africans, the enslaved Africans are coming over against their will to work on plantations that are run by European settlers. These plantations are all throughout the Americas. Of course, when I say plantation in the American context, we think of the cotton plantations of the South. But you have to realize those weren't the only plantations. Sugar plantations were much larger, much more numerous, and much more profitable. And the West Indies, countries today like Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, the Virgin Islands, would be Puerto Rico, Cuba, would be examples of locations of high sugar plantations. So therefore, most of the transportation of enslaved Africans are going to end up in the West Indies more than any other region. The second location is going to be in Brazil. And Brazil is run by the Portuguese. There's a point where the Catholic Church kind of steps in, and the Spanish are going to kind of get away from slavery. It's a long story. The Portuguese are going to really profit from slavery. It's not to say that Spanish colonies didn't have slavery. I don't want you to think that. But the Portuguese are going to be doing a lot of the business of bringing over enslaved Africans, because the Portuguese initially are the ones on the West African coast who are making the connections to acquire enslaved Africans and transport them over. So Spanish plantation owners certainly bought and sold, but the Portuguese are the ones doing a lot of the transportation. So Brazil, a Portuguese colony, is going to see the second most number of enslaved Africans arrive. And then your third one is the United States. And that's going to be largely in the South, but it is before the Revolutionary War, definitely up and down the 13 original colonies. So one of the things that you want to recognize is that the destination is all over the Americas, with most of it concentrated into the West Indies. But the second thing is you want to realize is that all the West European countries had their hands into this trade. The English, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, they were all engaged in this slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean, either transporting, buying and selling. Every European country, particularly those five, are involved. So now we go to the impact of slave trade on the African society. So now what we want to do is we want to shift, and this is something we always do. We want to look at the effects of something. So if you take a look at the map, what's really um, telling is if you look at the arrows, this starts to give you a sense of where the enslaved Africans were originating from along this West African coast and even down into Central Africa. And then if you follow the arrows, you'll see how so much of this ends up into the West Indies. And then how a lot of this ends up in Brazil, and then how smaller groups end up and down the East Coast of North America. And that just reinforces what I had talked about, where the destination of the enslaved Africans would be. So if you notice, a lot are coming from this region and from West Africa in particular. So how were the enslaved um, Africans acquired? And the process for obtaining or for enslaving Africans usually focused on the vulnerable groups. So the groups that were enslaved usually came from the lower segments of society. They were the ones that had the least protection within society. They were oftentimes your focus is going to be on males, young males, because of the nature of the work of the plantation system, but it's also going to include females. But males are going to be the primary one, the primary target. And you want to keep in mind that it comes, and this is true of slavery throughout history. It always targets the vulnerable groups. The second thing is that for Europeans, particularly the Portuguese, the idea of going inland to raid and to capture Africans and to put them into slavery, that is not what happens. There's a couple attempts at it and they failed rather miserably. For one thing, so when we look at number two, the reasons for the lack of European presence in the interior, there's really three reasons. One, there's plenty of African states who can defend themselves. The Portuguese don't have this great military advantage that allows them to impose their will on West African societies. And this is something we saw when we talked about Catholicism in Asia. The Portuguese couldn't impose Catholicism on China because China had military strength that could resist the Portuguese. So African tribes, African villages, African empires were more than capable of turning away Portuguese invasions. The second reason is that the Europeans did not have the technology to go against rivers to get to the inland, to get to the interior. So it was very difficult for them to physically get there. And then the third thing is that the disease of malaria acted as an effective defense against European intrusion because Europeans did not have an immunity or exposure to malaria, and getting exposed to malaria was certain death for any European explorer or conqueror or raider who was going into that region. So, for the most part, the Portuguese are going to show up on the coast of Africa and do business with, quote, African princes. And I put this in quote because Africa is a very large place. So we're talking about local princesses. They're not local princes. They're not acting in collaboration with some type of centralized effort. They're local princes who rule over tribes, and they start to make deals with the Portuguese. And what these princes will do is engage in capturing usually Africans from outside their tribes, outside their villages, and then selling them to the Portuguese. So this is where we start seeing a business relationship develop. And again, you have to bear in mind that the practice of selling and buying enslaved Africans was nothing new to this region. This had been going on before. The difference now is that it's shifting to the Atlantic coast and it's growing in size. So when we look at that role, we have to keep that in mind that there's two parts to this trade system. There's the people who demand the enslaved Africans, and there's the people who supply the enslaved Africans. And what's being exchanged? Alcohol, textiles, but particularly European rifles. So if you think about it, if you're an African prince, acquiring European muskets give you an advantage in tribal warfare. And that's what brings me, I just want to bring a point about letter B, is that when these European weapons are introduced, this is going to start to destabilize the system. It's going to destabilize the region. And larger central governments are going to start struggling, and smaller localized kingdoms are going to start to grow. So if you remember throughout our semester, what we've been talking about with West Africa is the development of pretty significant empires. That's going to be undermined by this developing slave trade that's going on. Which brings me to the growth of slave kingdoms. Okay. When we talk about slave kingdoms, we're talking about kingdoms in Africa where the wealth is based on this developing trade of enslaved Africans. And so what we start getting are new kingdoms that pop up. And kingdoms like Asante and Dahomey. You can put in Benin, Benin. And what I want you to understand, rather than just naming them, is I want you to understand that these kingdoms, if you guys remember throughout history, kingdoms grow because of economic transactions. They profit, the governments profit from the transaction by taxing and regulating it, and they start to grow in wealth and they grow in power. And that's exactly what we see here. Now, the other impact is a little bit more within the population. So far, we focused more on the upper class, if you will, the chiefs and the princes and the Portuguese merchants and how this business arrangement is developing. But then we want to look at the local level, since the population is going to be the population that's going to be focused for regarding enslavement is going to be male more than female. What's going to happen is that you're going to have the male segment of the population being removed, not completely, but enough to make a difference. And what that means is that females, mothers, daughters, wives, when the men are being pulled out, the women are going to start assuming more of the roles of what the men used to do, taking care of farming, in some cases, political leadership. And what we see is a shift within gender roles throughout this region. And the other thing that I should put in is that the population of Africa, if you remember, two things are going on. So go ahead and make this, you know what? I'll stop. I'll come back to it in a second. Let's go on to letter E. Letter E, the reorientation of trade routes in West Africa. What we learned was that there is this thing called the Trans-Saharan trade route, and that oriented West Africa across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean coast and out to the Middle East. So the trade went north and east. When we bring about the transatlantic slave trade in history, the trade reorients itself to the Atlantic coast. It starts to go south and west. And the trans-Saharan trade that we studied, it continues on, but it begins to diminish. and it's being replaced by a new trade network that goes through the southern and western coasts of the Atlantic Ocean. So you want to appreciate that change. And then letter F, I want you to throw in letter F. What I want you to throw in about letter F is that the African population does not expand as rapidly as we'll see in Europe and Asia. So if we back up to the Columbian Exchange, we know that new crops are coming into Africa. These new crops, as they do in Northern Europe and as they do in East Asia, in Africa, they're going to sustain a population growth. When you have more food, you have more people. But while the population may be growing, there's also this apparatus that is removing the population. So, on the whole, the African population does grow, but not at the rapid rate that we see in East Asia and Northern Europe at the same time during the 1700s. So, that's something to throw in as letter F. So, our last thing is the impact of African culture on the Americas. So, one of the things we've talked about is the introduction of European culture is going to transform the Americas. Catholicism is brought in, um, large scale agriculture is brought in. Native American culture is going to influence the European culture through forms of syncretism. We're also going to bring in this third group, the enslaved Africans. And that is going to have an impact on culture in the Americas. So, one, we've already talked about the religious impact. A lot of the enslaved Africans are going to be converted over mainly to Catholicism because most of where this slavery is in Spanish and Portuguese held areas. So what happens is that they convert over to Catholicism, not by choice, because Catholicism acts as a means of control. We also experience syncretism, and I've already covered this with the religion discussion. So I'll kind of keep this quick. Syncretism is the effect of where two things come together to create something new. So in this case, you have African religious tradition combining with Catholicism to produce new forms of religion within the Americas. And Vodun, which is a variation of voodoo, which we largely see in Haiti, Santiara, which is in Cuba, and Candibal, which is horribly pronounced, which is in Brazil. So these three are examples of religions that combine Catholicism with African traditional religions. And also, I think I mentioned how Christianity became a basis for resistance to the enslaved status of the Africans, and it becomes a way of resisting the colonial structure that Europe was giving. So the religious impact, again, that's something we've already talked about in the course. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back over that. But then you have your maroon societies. And the maroon societies, by definition, they are societies that are composed of Africans who have escaped slavery and have formed their own societies. So you have enslaved Africans who escape from slavery. They go into the woods, they go into the jungles, they go into, well, actually, that's where they do go. They go into places that are difficult to find them, and they start to connect with others who are like them. And they start to clear land, they start to plant crops, and they form their own societies. And these maroon societies are a great example of the type of resistance that existed towards slavery. In other words, slavery wasn't just accepted by these enslaved Africans. There were on the ships in the Middle Passage, there was plenty of mutinies and rebellions. There were within the plantations work slowdowns, work stoppages, and then escaping from the condition. So, and there were revolts. We'll see revolts take off in the 19th century, especially. But this wasn't a condition that was just accepted. It would be resisted. And the Maroon societies are an example of that. And one Maroon society that becomes sizable, just in terms of its scope, is found in Suriname. And it continues to be a separate ethnic group that kind of operates independently from the government, and yet has experienced attacks, has experienced persecution within the modern times. So Suriname, one of these maroon societies grows into a substantial society within the country of Suriname. And then other examples of cultural diffusion. Of course, you get cuisine, the influence on the preparation of food, where traditional African practices are going to be combined with American crops and combined with European products to produce new forms of cuisine. And then, of course, music. When we think about jazz, jazz has its roots within African roots, within African traditions. So, instruments, the way music is expressed, is going to take shape all throughout the Americas to create different forms of music that hadn't really existed before. So, that is kind of the broad overview of the transatlantic slave trade. Again, always come to class with your questions, or use your notes from class to reinforce what was lectured on here. So if you have any questions, as always, reach out. In the meantime, stay safe and thank you for listening.